Deborah, I wanted to ask you about how your idea of nourishing terrains, which I associate with local country, caring for country. I was wondering about how both of them, in a way, connect with the global. We're so in a sense under the hammer of the global now. Of these forces that are beyond our immediate country. Is there a chain of connection?
There are the most beautiful chains of connection, and we're accustomed to thinking of country in its local mode. The art tells us this, the songs tell us this, and land rights and everything tells us about these intense relationships between people and their country. The country that owns them or to which they belong. This is where your body comes from. This is what daily nourishes your body. But this is where meaning comes from. This is what keeps you engaged, keeps life meaningful. And this is where your action is oriented. So your intelligence is about understanding all this amazing stuff that's going on around you, because country isn't only about humans, it's about everything, and it's this big communicative matrix where you've really got to pay attention. So in that sense, we've sort of suddenly got rid of a big dualism that gets in our way of understanding almost everything. And that, I think, is the first part of the genius. I think you could say that that's true in my comparison between country and the Bible. We've got all these dietary restrictions and stuff in the Bible that, to most of us seem like a kind of antiquated thing. But when you think about it, it really is integrating at least the management of the body for people who don't have a soil that they own. They've still got their own bodies they can manage. So it's very much a management of the body, and it breaks down that mind-body distinction, which I think is a very, very important thing to be doing. Getting back to the global and the local, in the way in which Aboriginal country is all about place and all about creation, and the intense love that people have for country is part of that big nexus of all that it is best in them is nourished by that place. But every country is got its localized dreamings and it's got its traveling dreamings. And some of these travelers are really, really big travelers. And the song lines go along them. So you can never, ever sing the Black-Headed Python Dreaming track, for example. You can only ever sing parts of it, because Australia was too big for everybody to come together, everybody who belongs to that thing to come together to sing it. But you could bring the people who could manage to get there to sing it, and you can sing your part, and then they sing their part, and then they sing their part. So it's a global that stretches out sideways rather than going up hierarchically. And with this Black-Headed Python Dreaming that I know quite well, because I documented it for the Aboriginal Sacred Sites Authority in the Northern Territory, and then I documented it again for a land claim. So I really feel like I've been introduced to every site on one portion of that track, and is one of these big travelers. So she starts in the Indian Ocean, and she finishes, and she's a woman, which is an easier one for me to relate to in a way. She finishes in the ocean off the coast of Queensland. So one day when I was working on some of this documentation, one of the old men said to me, we always thought that when she went into the coast off Queensland, into the water there, the salt water there, that she stayed there. But now we know that there's land on the other side, so she must have kept going. And the implication of all of that is that where there's life, there's creation. And where there's creation, there's creators. And it only makes sense that the travelers would keep traveling. And you then get an integration of the global and the local that doesn't undermine either.
No, exactly.
Yeah, it really holds them together.
It's a beautiful idea,
yeah.
And it's so both complex and simple.
Yeah, exactly. It's so Aboriginal in that way.
That's right.
And it comes from here, which I think it is important for us to keep reminding ourselves that our best knowledge is always going to come from here. And a lot of it is going to have local applicability, but it's also going to have global implications, and we need to be talking on a world scene about knowledge that comes from here.
That's right. Deborah, I'm really interested to know whether our commitment in Australia and elsewhere for ecology, for the looking after the earth, is really being done in a way that's compatible with the Indigenous idea of caring for country and your concern and my concern for reconciliation with Indigenous people. These two things really compatible?
It's a really thorny question, and I think, there was a time when we thought that that actually would be the focus of reconciliation because it seemed so clearly to be what we all have in common. And it still is, in a way, what we all have in common is this ground that nurtures us. But Western caring for country, which they like to call even under names like land care and everything, which seems to reference it,
yes,
have moved further and further away from Indigenous culture. And there's one kind of exception to that general rule, and that is that some of the national parks and wildlife services have been sort of almost below the radar, developing ways to accomplish reconciliation within their own bureaucracies and within their own practices. So they've really commissioned a lot of work about Indigenous land care and Indigenous ecological knowledge, really asked questions about how that can be integrated into land management, and more than that, not just integrated into, but actually change the whole concept of land management. And I found in my consultations with New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service that, as you were saying, a lot of it is individual dependent, where there's an individual will. A lot can be done, and the goodwill of Aboriginal people is part of that. Of course, it can't happen without their really active participation and often really pushing National Parks and Wildlife Service to do more. But where you have a chief of staff who's willing to push things along, and there are some very excellent people doing this, you really see change happening at a level where it's not publicly visible. The big public stories really aren't telling us a lot about what we need to know about what really can be done.
Yes, and it's always an individual who's got it, who's actually been in contact with Aboriginal people, and suddenly realizes
Suddenly
what it's all about.
There's
what it's all
something
about.
there, yeah.
Yes, this is not what we do in standard land care.
Yeah.
It's something else. It's
Yeah.
something else.
The economics of it all has probably overtaken it all. So like in the Northern Territory, where they wanted to integrate burning, when they finally had their own studies to show, the scientists, had their own studies to show that Indigenous burning regimes actually took care of country. And it took a long time for them to
Get the message.
And to have the proof. So institute burning practices. Well, Aboriginal burning was, was curating. It was this handcrafted burning. And now they're dropping incendiary bombs out of helicopters. So it's not the same. And it doesn't have, and there's no economy in Australia that's going to employ people in the numbers that are needed to do that handcrafted stuff. And, in some areas like small bits of country under Aboriginal ownership, freehold title, they do.
Yes.
They take care of it absolutely properly. And there's lots of that. But that's not the big story, really. The big story is messy, messy, messy. I myself have doubts about questions of eradication. I just think that the idea of trying to manage country by killing everything you don't like doesn't sit well with a lot of Aboriginal people, and doesn't sit well with a lot of white fellas either. It doesn't sit well with me. But even if you're not out there killing everything, sort of letting hunters in to shoot crocodiles on a capitalist basis, is that really taking care of country? And I think as we go along, as the Western toolkit becomes ever more violent, I think the divergence between what Indigenous care of country would want care of country to be and what the economies of management driven by industries like the 1080 industry or the crocodile hunting industry or whatever are just pushing them further and further apart, really.